Welcome to Produce Talks, brought to you by the Canadian Produce Marketing Association. Each episode brings you fresh insights from leaders across the produce supply chain, growers, retailers, innovators, and experts shaping the future of fresh. Wherever you work in the industry, we're here to keep you informed, inspired, and connected. So let's get started.
Welcome to CPMA's Produce Talks. My name is Dan Duguay, CPMA's Senior Director of Sustainability, and I will be your host today. Building on our Fall 2025 Sustainability series, today we are revisiting the question of packaging, but focused on packaging innovation and what's driving packaging innovations today. If there's a topic that has dominated the sustainability conversation within the fresh produce industry over the past several years, it's packaging, and what the industry can do to reduce packaging waste after it has served its function of getting fresh produce from the field to the fork. Although minimizing packaging waste remains important for consumers as an outcome, it is increasingly being recognized that this should not come at the cost of increasing food waste or reducing shelf life or adversely impacting the effectiveness and the efficiency of the supply chains, and definitely not adversely impacting the affordability of food. So CPMA has many members who are leading packaging innovation for today's produce industry, and today we are joined by one of them who's pushing the boundaries of packaging innovation in food packaging, and that's Lucid Corporation. CPMA's Produce Talks is happy to welcome Edmund Chin, Managing Director and co-founder of Lucid Corp. With a degree in chemical engineering and over 25 years in plastics manufacturing, Edmund brings deep expertise in sheet extrusion, thermoforming, and the full circular life cycle of packaging, from collection and recycling to reprocessing. Edmund is the architect behind Lucid's innovative approach to scalable real-world sustainability solutions, turning complex packaging design into practical solutions that work. So Edmund, welcome to Produce Talks.
Hey, Dan. Thanks for having us on the show.
And before we get into it, now we have two chemical engineers on this conversation, so we will try to avoid going down the geek hole a little too much today, but I think this will be a great discussion. To kick us off today, let's start with defining what sustainable packaging design is. And there's arguably no better place to start than packaging design guidance that many industries, including the produce industry and the food industry at large, have been working with for several years now, and that's the Consumer Goods Forum Golden Design Rules. So the Golden Design Rules, or we'll call them GDR from this point forward, has been an important set of heuristics for guiding packaging design towards increased circularity. Edmund, can you share how the Golden Design Rules have helped Lucid towards increasing circularity design?
It's a great question in a sense that I don't know if the GDRs were designed by Lucid or vice versa. Lucid started as a company with the goal of being the most sustainable food packaging company with circularity goals already built in to its pillars. I think the Golden Design Rules have helped to validate what we're doing as a business. We're a vertically integrated custom thermoforming company that only converts PET. As a matter of fact, we only convert clear PET, which helps in improved recyclability and several of those check marks on the Golden Design Rules. We design our packaging and typically will educate our customers around fit for use and circularity. Obviously, the packaging must not only be functional, but it must protect and elevate the product, as you had mentioned. But we also stress the circularity aspects as part of our design process. Those would typically include talking about PCR content, minimizing plastic through design features within the packaging, ensuring that we're cubing out from a transport perspective for shipments, minimizing headspace in our designs, and other sustainable consideration such as avoiding colors. As I mentioned, we're strictly using clear PET in our products, eliminating, reducing additives in our products, no lamination, trying to move towards different directions from that perspective to just eliminate contaminations downstream for those processes. And, the GDRs have provided a great framework and credibility that helps that alignment with outside stakeholders, and hence why we're so excited about working closely along the GDRs.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I mean, because again, these heuristics have been around for several years, and I think they were really provided a sort of directional guidance, start thinking about these elements, but it's to see it in action that I think starts to reveal what does that actually mean. And I think there's examples at Lucid and other of our members, definitely at Lucid, where you're seeing kind of the golden design rules in action. So maybe if we can turn our attention, because I think there's a particular design, maybe amongst others, that I know Lucid has been driving, is if you can share kind of how the golden design rules were integral in getting the collective stakeholders, the marketing side, the design side, the food safety, the sustainability, sort of agree that this new design improves circularity without compromising the packaging's core functionality. And I know we've talked about this before, is the packaging function is really core to this whole conversation. I know we'll come back to that in a few moments on another question. But can you share how that sort of design-centric approach really helped that conversation? And I think especially, if I can offer it, Edmund, the padless design.
Correct. And that's the one that obviously pops to my mind as well, right?
Yeah.
A great example that we're talking about is our patented Lucid Infinity tray that was initially designed for proteins, but we're seeing so many significant interests in other fields such as cut fruits and berry containers, etc., that could utilize this technology. We've basically created what we believe is a tray out of necessity. Once we understood what the problems were with, I guess, circularity within the confines of using soaker pads that are glued onto trays, we saw that as a great opportunity to get to work to eliminate that hurdle of why circularity can't happen. And that's due to that glued on soaker pad that basically gets rejected by the recyclers due to some of the issues related to contamination and so forth within the recycling stream. So, we wanted to then figure out a way to do this and make sure that we maintained all of the integrity of the product and the packaging requirements as well. So what we have what we've developed is a tray that basically uses an insert to filter the purge below the protein or produce, eliminating the need for that soaker pad. And by trapping the purge, rather than using a colored plastic to hide it and so forth, we've been able to do this with clear PET. So part of technology is also incorporating a frosting into the design so that the purge is hidden, or the juices of the produce is hidden. We're able to recess that reservoir to the center of the container so that, as a consumer, you're not immediately seeing that purge. And again, we've gone through with our all our stakeholders, the sales and marketing team, to ensure that obviously costing needs to make sense. The design has to make sense from an attractiveness perspective. We've done that. We've gone to our food safety test team to ensure that the integrity of the produce or the protein is maintained, or if not elevated in some cases. We've talked to basically the processors on their pain points with regards to using a tray as such. So to ensure that it's properly denested, ensure that the wraps that are used is functional with the packaging. So being able to roll the edges on these trays helps to that regards. And we've taken the feedback of consumers all around to understand their likes and dislikes. And after hundreds of discussions and dozens of iterations, we think we've developed a tray that truly ticks all of those boxes in terms of the GDR, keeping everything clear, eliminating the glued on soaker pad, bringing value to the recycling stream by keeping it in clear, etc. So, I think checking all those boxes definitely helped in our goals of getting a truly circular product out to market. And We truly believe we are solving the world's biggest food packaging problem with a simple solution of eliminating a glued-on soaker pad, which results in billions of recyclable material going to landfill because it is rejected by the MRFs as a result of that glued-on pad.
Again, I think the point of today's discussion is that this was a packaging form which is obviously quite integral to our industry. I mean, certain commodities require the pad to deal with the fluid that builds up in the bottom. And again, as you mentioned, protein, a lot of protein foods also require the similar treatment.
This is where, in your segments, we talk about the berry containers. We talk about maybe a food service container for items such as sliced tomatoes, pickles, etc., that has a lot of purge, and maybe institutions, consumers, they don't want to be dealing with that. Cut fruits, watermelon, it's tremendous amount of purge and a tremendous opportunity in terms of improving the quality of the product as well.
Yeah. Thank you for the walkthrough, because I think for some of our listeners, I suspect are not even aware of the work that you've been doing. So I think the key point here is this was really rooted in functionality. It was rooted in that the pad is necessary for products that have a significant amount of purge, and that needs to be managed. So here you are looking at a packaging design really from a functionality perspective. How do you manage purge, but then how do you achieve this recyclability, this circularity once the package has been utilized and is empty? And again, I'll share with the audience, I think it's one of probably the best examples of the golden design rule number 2, eliminate a problematic element, right? The problematic element is the glued pad, and here's a design that has eliminated it without compromising the functionality that was originally intended. And I think on that, I want to maybe ask you, Edmund, your experience, because there's a lot of guidance out there. I mean, we've talked about the golden design rules, but there's a lot of guidance that the industry is currently facing. And that guidance can be from the Association of Plastics Recyclers. It can be in Canada, Éco-Entreprise Québec has guidance. We know that the producer responsibility organizations in the multiple provinces are likely going to put out some guidance. And this is all guidance to help drive packaging design towards circularity. But one of the concerns that I know many of our members have expressed, and I suspect you've heard, is, that design guidance has to be taken, you have to take functionality into account. You have to recognize ultimately there's a core function that this packaging is trying to play. And you've had experience in that work with either protein or food as a product and now produce as a product.
Right.
What can you share in terms of the role that that guidance more broadly is playing, and are we accurately capturing that functionality consideration in the work, or is that something we still need to be more cautious around?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dan, and I think from our perspective, and what I keep telling our team is, we don't know what we don't know. So therefore, we need to continue to educate ourselves and communicating with our upstream and downstream partners to help broaden our perspective on, providing technical insights, understanding their hurdles and so forth. And with every jurisdiction, maybe there's something slightly different. You've talked about APR. They will provide guidance around recycling. We have the PPWR in Europe that talks about recycling in Europe. We talk about the EEQ in Quebec, and they will have their own nuances. And it's good to understand it, know where the packaging is going, understand the fit for use and so forth, but also understand that maybe we can't do everything all at once, but understanding what their pain points are, we can target to try to make our products more friendly and less stressful for them to reclaim and or process that product downstream. So, a good example would be, you could have a PET container, yet you pat yourself on the back, I'm doing great, but you put on a label that might not meet APR guidance from a recyclability perspective, and that label could be worse than a laminated product because it can't be removed from the packaging, and hence you're adding more contaminants into that recycle stream, and it forces now the recycler or the MRF to now reject what is a completely recyclable tray because it has a label that doesn't come off in the wash process, or the glues are discoloring the materials, etc. So there are many little nuances like that that we as converters and within this whole circular process need to educate ourselves around and distill that information to help create this circularity more so, and help take these complexities and break them down into practical design solutions that works for everyone. And I think that's a great example with a label, just understanding what that does for downstream, maybe upstream, understanding if they can understand how to then apply that instead of a full 100% glued surface, maybe it's a strip. So there are different things that helps all around that we should be educating ourselves both upstream and downstream on.
I'm going to offer, I think, design thinking is something that's quite common in a lot of markets. You start with this idea of functionality and all these constraints and these expectations that a product is expected to play. And I think what's interesting in your story is that you've really applied design thinking to this, what some people would probably consider a relatively simple product, a
Right.
package for fresh produce or a package for protein. And yet, because of all of those factors or facets that are important, like food safety and shelf life maximization and minimizing food waste and managing purge and ultimately making it recyclable. The way that you describe this is very much it's design thinking in the context of food packaging. And I start with that because I'd be curious, given your experience in these multiple sort of food fields, there's the design guidance, but I think I see a conversation moving, Edmund, more to this question of total cost of ownership, total cost of packaging ownership, which in the current context, extended producer responsibility fees are having a material impact on some. But there's other economic considerations that obviously come into account in packaging decision. So you've got the upfront cost of the package, you've got the downstream cost of the EPR fees, but then you have those indirect costs like shelf life and food loss and waste rates and recall risks and all those things, which all have a dollar sign. Can you share, and I'm asking this in the context, is this kind of where design guidance needs to go, is to provide better clarity on the things that need to be accounted for to, if anything, minimize the total cost of ownership? Because you might have a slightly higher upfront cost on a more sophisticated form of package, but it generates a significant set of savings.
Correct, throughout this process.
Yeah. And then if you do the total math, you get this total cost of ownership. Curious what your experience has been, if that's how that's come up, and how maybe the work you've done taking a design thinking approach has maybe helped navigate sort of that total cost of ownership consideration. Your thoughts on that?
I think the GDRs are a great tool and a great template for improved understanding of circularity. And as such, we need to develop stronger alignment with throughout this whole circularity of packaging materials and the process that can then maybe drive, whether it's government legislations to move things in a direction that says this is good for the overall circularity. And one of the things just popped in my head, but I talk about always is typically what we need to do is ensure it is good for the buyer, it is good for society, it's good for the seller. If we can basically check all three of those in a solution, then it likely came through a GDR guide. And what is good for everyone is likely something that is very feasible. In order to validate how we move forward, there needs to be some sort of data that can substantiate that we're moving in the right direction. And, you know, getting further audits done on what is truly circular. Today it may be considered circular, but if the packaging instruction is so complex that the consumer doesn't do their fork and put it into the recycle bin with all of the necessary steps, then you've just contaminated the process, right? So understanding what comes back through, how easy is it for that consumer to make that determination to just put it into the recycling bin, or are they going to read through that little label that tells you, remove this, wash this, do that? And those are things that I think EPR fees and so those that are paying into that, maybe they don't take those things into consideration enough. So if there are ways that we can close this loop where what you put on the shelf is audited, what you get into the MRF is then the sounding board for whether that is the right fee or not. What should be rewarded and what should be penalized should then basically help drive maybe how this works better and to create, as you say, a lower overall cost. Because to be sustainable, we need to help downstream understand the upstreams and maybe in some cases compromise today to simplify it for the consumer. I think those are all important steps on how maybe we go about this.
I've heard some frame it as, if you look at packaging, again, you could take a total cost of ownership perspective and say, here's where the cost shows up along the supply chain. But another way that I've heard it framed is, how does it enable the most sustainable supply chain period? So again, if you measure that back to your audit kind of comment, if you measure the overall sort of performance, ultimate success of a package design by things like, what is the level of shrink or food loss? What is the nominal shelf life? What is the consumer acceptance and consumer comfort with this design, especially if there's a role for the consumer in the disposal of the package beyond its simple discarding for a moment?
Right.
I know we've heard repeatedly, these very innovative designs that require so much intervention on the part of the consumer that the risk is that actually won't happen, right?
Exactly.
And it's that full sort of supply chain perspective. You go, this is where, that supply chain is really efficient, effective because the package design is, so back to that design thinking gets those elements right.
The design thinking, the thinking along the adoption of the packaging as well, right? Things that are difficult to recycle and so forth that requires lots of effort from the consumer is going to be, something that likely won't happen cost effectively. And, today, maybe we have to push further fees on those. Yes. And now the brand owners and the grocers that are paying these fees, they have to look at those. Obviously you may get an extended shelf life with a product, but you may have to sacrifice because the cost of protecting that product and extending its shelf life doesn't allow for circularity today. And these are things that we need to consider, and maybe those that you are constantly seeing as being recycled easily, those gets rewarded. So the less of the contaminants on the PET, the better the less fees you pay, or maybe you're rewarded for that as a result of that packaging, etc. So I think these are things that we need to look at, and it may sound simple, but there are many tentacles and so forth involved in.
I would share that in the few conversations that we've started to have around eco-modulation, in other words, fees being modulated as a function of that environmental performance, but also maybe the question of eco-modulation in reflection or in an attempt to better capture the net environmental impacts of that packaging, right? So again, if you look at the potential to reduce food loss and waste or to improve shipping efficiencies, and like if this is all measured only through, and again, I think this is the conversation now, right? It's way more layered, it's way more sophisticated, and now you have, design thinking coming into packaging design. And again, I commend Lucid for creating what is arguably probably, a poster child for golden design rules and eliminate problematic element. And there's something that I think even consumers can understand. It goes, oh, I see what's going on. You got rid of the pad, but you're still doing the same thing that the packaging used to do. Oh, that's cool. So maybe in closing today, Edmund, I mean, there's so much to I joke this, there's always so much to unpack
Exactly.
in packaging. But if you were to give one piece of advice to our listeners about how to drive development and adoption of innovative packaging, and if anything, how to drive design thinking into packaging work for produce, what would it be based on the experience you've had to date?
Not necessarily a simple answer, Dan. I think the way I would encourage those that are looking at this is don't look at it as a hurdle. Look at it as an opportunity, but also an inevitability. We do need to get more sustainable and circular in many ways, and embrace it. Lean in and approach the GDRs with a mindset focused on the full system-wide circularity, not just your angle of it. And if you can understand the upstreams and the downstreams of it, it will help further this circularity, and let it be a part of your packaging consideration. It shouldn't be an afterthought. This is stuff that should be on the forefront, and then leverage that adoption. There's many ways you can leverage this adopting the GDRs and come out ahead. And just from a society perspective, there's an entire generation of young people that are significantly more conscious of protecting the environment and being more sustainable. And I think once they understand this circularity, they will choose your products. And I think those are all wins for everyone, including society, when this is done.
Yeah. Thank you, Edmund, because again, it's remarkably complex set of challenges, that from the outside, most consumers and most people probably don't appreciate. So again, thanks for walking us through the work that you've been doing and the experience and the insights that you've gained to date. And again, what I would say is taking a design thinking approach to this, packaging challenge. So maybe I'll just share, I think our audience would agree that we've come a long way from packaging questions many years ago, which was really simply put as, what's a good plastic versus a bad plastic? What's recyclable versus non-recyclable? And now here we are today talking about, what's the best packaging design that serves my supply chain and drives down my total cost of ownership? It's really moved a long way.
And it's taking these, maybe we in the industry may not see it driving fast enough, but, incremental steps are definitely wins as well. And we need to look at that and continue to make those strides.
Thank you, Edmund, for sharing how Lucid's, I think, helping drive these innovations, and again, incorporating design thinking to benefit the industry. And so maybe with that, I'll bring today's podcast to a close. So thank you, Edmund, for, again, your insights and your thoughts today. And I'll invite our listeners to check out the other CPMA Produce Talks podcasts, wherever you get your favorite podcast. We will also invite our listeners to stay tuned we'll be back in the late spring of 2026 with a new sustainability series that will focus on food loss and waste mitigation, best practices to reduce emissions, and optimizing fresh produce supply chain sustainability, which I suspect will include an important packaging element given the conversation we've had today. So until then, take care. Thanks again, Edmund. And thank you to our listeners for spending time with us today.
Thanks, Dan.